This is Auburn Mayor Ron Anders, and I welcome you to our second edition of One Conversation, which is a part of the One Auburn initiative. And tonight we are very excited to have Dr. Taffye Benson Clayton as our second ever guest with One Conversation. Dr. Clayton is the inaugural Vice President and Associate Provost for Inclusion and Diversity at Auburn University. Dr. Clayton, thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, Mayor Anders.
Very excited to learn about you, and if you could just take a few minutes here and just introduce yourself to our audience, those who might not have read your bio at Auburn University, and just kind of tell us where you've been and how you got here.
Sure. So as you all know, my name is Dr. Taffye Benson Clayton. I have the absolute pleasure of serving and privilege of serving as Auburn's inaugural Vice President and Associate Provost for Inclusion and Diversity. And I came to Auburn, Alabama by way of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so before serving here, I served as Associate Vice Chancellor at UNC Chapel Hill, which was my alma mater. And prior to that, I served at East Carolina University as Associate Provost and Chief Diversity Officer as well. I was born in Lumberton, North Carolina, raised in Fayetteville, North Carolina, daughter of my mom was an educator, and my dad was career military. And I just had a great experience with diversity early on, some of which we'll get into. But I'm excited about being here and being a part of the Auburn community, and really pleased to be engaged sort of in this moment of change that our nation and our community is experiencing.
Well, we're glad to have you and glad to have you in Auburn, and look forward to our conversation this evening. Dr. Clayton, when you talk about diversity and inclusion, what drew you to those topics as your life's work?
You know, it's interesting. I really do think the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion chose me. And it started very early for me as a kid, just the exposure that I had to the folks in my community. I grew up in a predominantly Black community, but also the kind of different contexts that I was operating in. I was really active in theater as a child. And that took me into contexts that were very, very diverse and heterogeneous. I also, as I mentioned, was a military kid. And an interesting thing about that is while we worshiped at a church that was predominantly Black in our neighborhood, we also would make visits to the main post chapel that was very international and diverse in its nature. And so again, sort of it started very informally for me early on. And then through college, I was a resident advisor. And so I had an opportunity to have responsibility for students in my residence hall. And at a predominantly white institution for me, that meant a lot of diversity around me. And so I began to engage and be this interesting sort of bridge person that sort of grew out of that context. And so that's really how it happened for me. And I think my life has been enriched by the diversity that I've experienced.
When you talk about those two words, diversity, inclusion, how do you separate those words, and then how do you relate those words?
Certainly, you know, diversity is very simply put all the ways that human beings are different. By nature, its definition is very broad and encompassing. On the other hand, inclusion talks about what it means to belong, what it means to matter. It's about respect and dignity and valuing each individual's worth. And that, of course, is a topic that we talk about a lot in the workplace, certainly on a college campus with students and faculty, staff, and administrators. And also even more specific and nuanced when we talk about inclusion in the academic context, it's really about the ongoing active intentional efforts to reap the educational benefits of diversity, right? We talk a lot about this concept around inclusive excellence, understanding the fusion between diversity and excellence and the way in which diversity actually is a strength. and it makes us better.
Talking about your dad, your being a military child, how do you compare that world of the military when it comes to diversity and inclusion of everybody, and then compare that to an academic setting? I would
You know,
imagine there's some similarities and there's some differences.
yeah, and in some ways, I will say the military and the Army. So my dad was in the Army, particularly as I became a professional in this work doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I found is that the Army and other branches of the military really did lead the way. They were some of the primary submitters of these amicus briefs that were a part of a lot of the conversation early on with respect to diversity as it relates to affirmative action. Now, let me go back and say, as a kid, my experiences with diversity were more about the exposure, right? Being on base and seeing people who were different. And that really also enriched our community in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I am not the Army brat that got to travel. My dad was Special Forces Green Beret. And so most of the time we couldn't know where he was. And we didn't have the opportunity to go with him various places. But I still was able to be exposed to this kind of diversity that you get from what it means to have folks in the military nearby as a part of my upbringing. And what's interesting as well, I'll get to the university and military contrast, is that this diversity occurred while at the same time I had a very intracultural experience, right? Living in a primarily African American community, going to primarily African American schools, having my principal live across the street. And so there was also that sense of understanding sort of my own culture. That I think was a strengthening pieces too, as well. So strengthened in my own culture and then enriched by the culture of others. So I do see the connection around the military and the advancements and really the way in which, over the past 10 years, and likely more than that, but 10 years I can speak to, the military has had a clarifying voice in the importance of diversity as a part of or as an asset to our national security,
Yeah.
Which is particularly important. And at Auburn, because, I work directly with General Burgess, who's our executive vice president. We have a 4-star on our board as well, Lloyd Austin. And so there's an aspect of familiarity for me that I think is pretty cool to be able to engage in this way.
Your dad is a Green Beret. That really was the only color that mattered.
Yes.
Did it matter that he was an African American Green Beret? He was a part of a select group of people who did a lot of work on our behalf.
It was a very elite population, and I'm learning that now in terms of my brother being career military, recently retired as a lieutenant colonel. And I will say both I certainly, when you are defending this country, right, and you are in the moment of doing that, what matters is the unity of strength. And I also must say, there were times when African American soldiers came back home and weren't welcomed in the way in which they would have expected or liked or even deserved, right? So I'm able to sort of sit with that dissonance as well, but certainly understanding the unity of strength that is so critical in terms of being effective and successful in defending our country.
I love that term, unity of strength. So you come to Auburn to be the first ever vice president for diversity and inclusion. What is that like to really build a program, to build a mindset, to build what you're building here on this campus and in this community?
Well, first of all, it's an incredible opportunity and privilege. And one of the things I've learned throughout my work at various institutions, Mayor, is that I'm a builder. I enjoy building teams. I enjoy prospecting for talent. I enjoy bringing people together and inspiring them around a goal. And that's part of what team building is. And I've had to do it at every institution where I found myself. And it's been a pleasure, a real pleasure to do. I also think that I enjoy working in organizations to advance strategic goals around diversity. And I feel like at Auburn, we are really getting our rhythm, right? We are now a full year and a few months into a new strategic plan. We have been able to integrate goals for diversity into those plans. There is a centralization piece as it relates to the work that we do institutionally, sort of my operation, sort of leading the charge in an advisory way, in a facilitative way. But also we have all these decentralized units, colleges and schools and administrative units who are doing the work as well. And now we're sort of in a flow with those goals and things and strategies established that we can now begin to monitor and measure and get a real sense of how we're doing. And the Presidential Task Force for Opportunity and Equity is sort of looking at those kinds of things too, right? We can benefit from the strategic plans, the integrated goals that are already out there, but we can also look at some things that are really top of mind, things that we really need to take a closer look at. And it has allowed us to focus in on the opportunity of this moment that has been focused around matters of race. But we know that the last 6 to 8 months has also been characterized, the months seem to run together now, but has been characterized by this triple challenge of COVID-19, of a challenged economy, and also of the racial injustice that our country is having to reckon with, and that's a very important thing for us to do.
When you first came to Auburn to where you are today, I would have to believe when you first landed on campus, you might have had to explain, this is what I'm doing and this is why I'm doing it, and people might have thought, we have one of those, or we need that, or can you kind of reflect back on some of those early introductions and reactions to people across the campus?
Sure, I'm happy to. And interestingly, I have to say, one, I wasn't exactly sure where Auburn was, but the search firm made me aware of that. I did know it was in Alabama, but I did think the university was private and not public. And so I have to say that the students and the administrators, so the leadership at that time, which happens to be the leadership now at the top, Dr. Googe, I felt like folks were really resolute in what it was that they wanted. And that's because, Mayor, I came in following a climate study. And there were already 17 recommendations as a blueprint for action for the work that the university thought needed to be done. And the beauty of that is that it was a collective work product from folks across the campus. And so I had a playbook to work from, sort of coming into the campus, and also people leaning in to be helpful in the process. So I didn't have to do quite as much explaining as you would perhaps expect, because I was able to use that blueprint as the strategic scaffolding to really begin to advance a strategy. And step one was really working with colleges and schools and administrative units to establish these goals. And of course, there were a number of other things that were going on, right? We don't just do the metrics and the measures and et cetera, but we also work directly with some of our diverse student programming through our Access and Inclusive Excellence subunit led by Ada Wilson. We look at matters of education, research, and strategy, and particularly now, the educational pieces have been so important. People want to learn about diversity. They want to learn about equity and social justice and inclusion, and we're certainly providing those services across our campus, engaging faculty, really looking at matters of diversifying the faculty. And what's really nice now, Mayor, is that the work that we've been doing through OID and across the campus with numerous partners has now been elevated through this presidential task force, which I'm particularly excited about, and which has brought together a really unique group of folks to advance it further. So I had to do some explaining, but again, not as much as you would expect, because I think folks were clear having gone through that climate assessment process.
The timing was everything. I mean,
That's
Auburn
right.
was ready for you at that
That's
time.
right.
And you feel like that you've plowed the ground here, being here for a couple of years, and now you're starting to see some of the fruits of your effort.
I think so. And, diversity is a work in progress. People are at different points along the spectrum of their level of understanding. But if people come with open minds and open hearts, leaning into the process, I think that that's what I so appreciate. There are some things that we're able to advance more quickly. There are quick wins. And then there are things that take time. There are things that take strategy and course correction, right? And better strategy to get at. And we're working on all of it. And I think Auburn is in an important position right now to be able to move some things forward. We have, as you likely know, a vice president for enrollment management who joined us. I think it's been maybe almost 2 years, Dr. Joffrey Gaiman, an African-American female who's doing really important work to advance this, working with folks across the campus, working with members of my team and other colleagues as well. And I just share that because that had been one of the major pieces when I came in, right? The matter of diversifying the enrollment and specifically Black students. And we're beginning to make, right, some very initial progress with that, with Joffrey, Dr. Gaiman having joined our team, and certainly Dr. Cook has been involved in terms of some of the outreach efforts. We've actually been working collaboratively on something called Gear Up, and it's an incredible program that's federally, so it's a result of a federal grant, but it's allowed us to be able to really begin to focus in on some of the counties where we have not had as many students recruited to Auburn from, particularly counties in the Black Belt, and really focus in on strategies there, and sort of we are sort of sharing that process and all making a contribution in that respect, and also really engaging others across campus to be a part of that as well. We have a great number of campus partners who help us advance this work.
When you think about the African-American teenager that's growing up in Alabama, that's 16, 17, sophomore, junior, they're starting to consider their options after college. What are they thinking about Auburn University of 2020, 2021?
It is interesting because it depends, right? If they've had exposure to our campus, if they've had some point of connection, maybe they've connected through 4-H, which is an incredibly helpful mechanism for students to make a connection. I think when students have some degree of connection or exposure, if they know someone who came to Auburn and was successful and had a good experience, that's very helpful for students. As you say, the profile, an African-American student who's 16 or 17, who's thinking about their future. I think that if they've been exposed, they may be considering Auburn. If they haven't, they may not. And that's why connecting and exposure is so important. We have an interesting program, Mayor, that's called Tiger Connect. And what we do is that we have members of sort of an ambassador group with our unit to return to their high schools for fall break and for spring break, and to offer, thoughts about what their Auburn experience has been, and to really be able to demonstrate to students, right, what is possible there's nothing like, I think, going back to your own community
That's a first
and
hand.
being able to engage students and talk to them
Absolutely.
in ways that they can begin to see themselves here. And so we certainly want to do more of things like that. It is very impactful. And we're just wanting to build on those kinds of strategies that allow us to do it. There are camps. Gear Up, for example, had a camp that brought in hundreds of students to our campus during the summer, right? And now we have our first Gear Up class that was admitted as a part of this particular admission cycle. They're now here, and we're being able to engage with them very directly as well. Again, in collaboration with our campus partners. So there is some work underway, and I think in time we're going to be able to see the outcomes, the impact, and the benefit, and that's what we're working toward.
Speaking of profile, Dr. Clayton, I've been wanting to talk to you about this because I've really felt this. Auburn's got an African American female student government association leader right now.
Mm-hmm.
We have an African American leader of our athletic department. Speaking of profile,
Yes.
maybe the most popular person in this whole city is our
Right.
Jewish basketball coach.
Right.
And I think in some ways that is a big deal, but I'm also proud to think that in today's Auburn, that's not a big deal. That
Mm-hmm.
these are the people who have been hired or elected to do the jobs, and everybody's behind them and supporting them. Do you sense that too? Is that kind of an old school local guy just trying to make everything look good and sound good, or is that reality?
I think the support is there. I think the support is there. And I think it's interesting to note why the support is so important. Because if indeed you are the first,
Mhm.
right? Or in some cases the only, or
Right.
maybe the most visible, right? There can be a real weightiness that goes along with that when you think you're sort of carrying that sort of alone, because there's a lot of pressure and responsibility, right? When you're the only, you really want to get it right, and when you're the first, you want to get it right. And that's not to say that we all don't have human error, but I'm also keenly aware that when you find yourself being first in a context, that again, sometimes it's the extra kind of accountability we even put on ourselves
Mhm.
to want to do things so well. And so that support means so much. It's interesting in diversity and inclusion work as well, because we talk about this state of what it means when you get this critical mass. So you get to a point, and we're not there yet, but I make this as a point because it is important when we begin to think about what critical mass allows. It actually allows African Americans to be seen more as individuals than not. It doesn't mean that we aren't always a part of community, and that is, speaking as an African American, a very important part of our culture. But in organizations, the whole idea of continuing to diversify, right, and getting really good at it, and having our populations be more representative, it really allows folks to feel less of that sense of burden that one could feel, and that burden's not the right word, but less of that sense of accountability and such a restricted margin of error around things that often accompanies it. So I can't say enough about, and the people you mentioned are just wonderful colleagues. Bruce Pearl, who I've gotten to know as a part of the presidential task force, and I'm really, really enjoying our collegiality and the ability that my team and I have actually been engaging with his team, talking through some important matters of diversity and inclusion. And I think you also mentioned Alan, who's incredible. He and his wife and what they have meant, and family, what they have meant to the Auburn community. All of these things are important indicators And they can also, Mayor, be signals to folks that, hey, did you see what Auburn is doing? All of that makes a difference when people are considering, right? Is Auburn a place for me? Whether it's as an individual who is Jewish, or whether it's someone who's African American or Latino, or or other populations, LGBTQ populations as well. All of these are important signals that Auburn is a place that is inclusive and is growing and is leaning in, and all of that is important and means a lot.
How do you take this subject matter and this effort that you're working with primarily on a academic in an academic setting on a college campus? How does that spill over into everyday America or to the community that this university lies in?
You know, I think that there are lots of opportunities for us to think about what those synergies are. And, you know, the best thinking I could offer is by way of experience and how these things have kind of played out in other contexts where I've been. And you and I, Mayor, have had a chance to talk about this a little when we chatted about this this One Auburn initiative that you conceptualized. But there are always interesting opportunities for connection around universities and their surrounding communities. I remember one of my first opportunities sort of diving into the university community relationship when I was at East Carolina. Was I walked into the role, I got a promotion, walked into the role as assistant to the president or assistant to the chancellor. And one of the first assignments he gave me, he said, you know, I want to do an initiative on race, and I'd like for you to lead it. And I thought, wow. And I think I wrote a grant, and we got some outside funding from it, from a state foundation. And then, right, there was an opportunity to talk to a number of different stakeholder groups. And so there I was, maybe about 3 years into my time there, sitting with folks from the chamber and sitting with folks from the clergy community, and sitting with folks from the nonprofit community, talking about, right, how could we approach this together? And we ended up having a really important partnership that resulted in conversations on race occurring all across the community, in synagogues, in churches, in the Boys and Girls Club, in libraries, in people's homes. And what was really important about this is that it brought people together to have these conversations. I have not forgotten that in the way in which it enriched me and also impacted our community. In another context, right, in Chapel Hill, there was an opportunity to look at how we could impact affordable housing. We had an instance where a community that had been historically African American was a place that African Americans and honestly working class folks could no longer afford to live in, and it was being really utilized a lot as student houses because developers were buying up the housing. And we had this incredible community process bringing folks together to talk about priorities, to talk about what it meant to live in diverse communities. We were able to leverage some funding from our real estate foundation there and from the self-help credit union. And we actually were able to buy back some properties and then begin to land bank those, and then begin, right, to offer these affordable housing options to members of the working class, many of them staff at the university who couldn't afford to live in the town. And that allowed for the replenishing of a neighborhood that became more diverse, with some of the African Americans who had been there historically and were able to hold on to some of the property that they had, but a new breed of working class, white folks and Latinos and others. And it is sort of a mark for me of the power of collaboration and collective problem solving and community enrichment and really the essence of what it means to live in diverse community, and then to solve some critical problems in really creative ways. And so I think those things can be looked for in any college community. I'm a lover of college towns. I think they have a special energy, and I'm sure in time you and I will be talking more about the ways that we can do that. One thing that I think is important for us to consider, we're talking a lot about diversity and diversifying Auburn, and I think allowing folks, however they identify, but particularly when they identify in a group that's historically underrepresented and they're coming to Auburn, to find a place to be able to connect authentically is so very important. And so that's, I think, an opportunity to explore. Maybe there's some things that we can think about creatively and begin to do that really indicate to folks that this is a place where you can come and be an accomplished professional, and where you can also find ways to meaningfully engage in community, to have a sense of intracultural community with people with whom you may identify racially or ethnically, and then even beyond that, right? To use that as a platform to be able to also engage more broadly and really make a contribution, not only to the university, but to the community where you live.
The idea of being a part of a community, to have a sense of a community, to be engaged, to be respected. We're living in such a troubled times, and just here in the last 24 to 48 hours, there's been unrest that has come from the city of Louisville, that is spread across to other cities in our country, that has been ongoing really through the summer. Where do you see the United States right now in relation to this topic of respect and racial reconciliation, and how does that impact inclusion?
We have a lot of work to do. I think we're a very divided country right now. And, I say that with a heavy heart because I also believe in the promise of this country as well. And I think right now we're living beneath that. And that we need to elevate to the point of where that promise becomes more of a reality to folks, and that folks really can believe in it. I think that this matter of race impacts all of us. It impacts, yes, me as an African American, but it impacts everyone else as well. And it's a central issue. And it has been the case that while race is so much of a part of American society, that we tend to notice it more broadly as a society when there are incidents, or when there are tragedies, or when there's unrest. That tends to focus our attention. When the truth of the matter is that racism, and race relations affects our daily lives. And, it was interesting when I did that initiative years ago. That was like 20 years ago, if you could believe that. I had just gotten appointed to the chancellor's cabinet in East Carolina. I was 29 years old, and we were focusing in on this topic. And we began to unpack the way that race, it affects our access to housing, or can affect it, quality of food, technology, education. It impacts how we experience our communities. It impacts how we experience policing, learning environments, all of these kinds of things. And while it's not always the singular thing, right, because we live in the reality of intersecting identities, and we can talk about that a little later too, in terms of the intersecting identity that I have as a Black woman, and some other identities as well. But to this matter of race, I think we really have to keep in mind that where we find our country today, right, we can improve that. But we also need to think about, right, what has been the reality of our country historically. And that is not in an effort to take us back, but it is in an effort for us to understand, right, how we've gotten to this place. Often when we look at incidents and unrest and et cetera, we don't see the connection as the residual impact of the experiences of African American individuals, those of us who are descendants of slaves, right? So 400 years of slavery, followed by Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and then the Civil Rights struggle. And then being here in Auburn, right, in the state of Alabama, so close to the cradle of the movement when so many of these diverse alliances were able to provide us with the gains that we've experienced, right? Just honoring that, just really understanding what all of that means. And so how does that impact things like what we find to be the economic realities for African Americans? You know, I really do think that the strength of problem solving, as you know, Mayor, I worked on the Hill for a while as a legislative research fellow on the Senate side, the U.S. Senate with Senator Ted Kennedy. And I was always encouraged by the way in which I saw lawmakers, regardless of their party, right? They would get on the Senate floor and they would be absolutely committed and absolutely convinced of what it was that they were championing for. But they would also be seen at the monocle, right, across lines of difference, having dinner together, vacationing together, even though they may have had different ideological points of view. What am I saying? That I think that manner of civility is so critically important for our nation right now. And I also believe in what it means for people of goodwill, policymakers, people who are studying some of the issues in our community, right? To really be able to focus in, to look at how race is impacting the reality and the experiences of individuals who identify as Black, but also to look at how it's impacting our entire country, and then to look more broadly about how do we create more opportunity, how do we create more access, how can we ensure that that kid in our state is getting a quality education, and how does that occur for more of our students, you know, more kids. Obviously, I feel deeply about it, and I just think as we consider where we are today, that reflecting on the history of where we've been is an informative approach, right? To ensure that we don't disconnect the two, because there are residual impacts. Now, those things can be positively impacted, but we have to think this through, and we have to have, I think, open minds and open hearts to really understanding what this means, and to also receive those of goodwill who are trying to be a part of the solution as well, and hopefully compel and be persuasive to those who may not yet be a part of the coalition of the willing, but certainly can become that.
You know, Dr. Clayton, it seems so important this time more than ever that we need to sit and talk and listen
Absolutely.
to one
Absolutely.
another. And it's certainly my hope and prayer that these one conversations that are coming forth from One Auburn maybe is a table setter for Auburn to get around the table and spend more time listening to one another and talking to one another, and hopefully through that respect and care for one another will come forth from that. So I want to thank you for your time this evening. I've kept you longer than I told you that we would keep you, but your answers are powerful and your experiences are rich and helpful. And we're proud to have you in our community, working at our university. And I personally look forward to many more times of collaboration and work with you in the future.
I'm delighted that you asked me to be a part of this conversation. I so appreciate the work that you're doing, and you let me know whenever we need to talk or to collaborate. I'm happy to be here as a colleague and as a citizen in Auburn to help these things move forward. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Have a good evening.
Thank you.